Welcome back to the podcast, everyone. Today, we're diving into a topic that, at first glance, might seem a little contradictory or even provocative. We're going to explore the complex relationship between monks, religion, and yes, even alcohol and drugs. And to help us navigate this fascinating, sometimes controversial landscape, I'm thrilled to have artist and researcher Tom with us today. Tom, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Peter. It's a topic that really opens up a lot of questions about spirituality, human experience, and cultural context,
Absolutely. I think for most people, the image of a monk, regardless of the tradition, is one of asceticism, discipline, and certainly abstinence from things like alcohol or recreational drugs. Is that a fair initial assessment?
It's absolutely the prevailing and in many ways accurate general rule. For the vast majority of mainstream monastic traditions across the globe, the consumption of alcohol and mind-altering drugs is, indeed, strictly prohibited. And the reasons for this are really quite profound and consistent.
So what are those core reasons? What's driving this universal prohibition in so many different religious contexts?
Well, the primary reason, arguably, is the emphasis on clarity of mind. Monastic life is all about spiritual discipline, whether that's meditation, prayer, contemplation, or self-awareness. Intoxicants are seen as direct impediments to these practices. They cloud the mind, impair judgment, and can lead to heedlessness or distraction from the spiritual path. Think about it. Okay, how can you achieve deep meditative states if your mind is fuzzy?
That makes perfect sense. You need that focus, that sharpness, to truly engage with spiritual work.
Exactly. Take Buddhism, for instance. The fifth precept for lay followers, and it's even stricter for monastics, is to abstain from intoxicants which lead to heedlessness. Mindfulness and clear comprehension are absolutely central to Buddhist practice. Alcohol and drugs directly undermine that. Similarly, in Christianity, while wine is used ritually in the Eucharist, drunkenness is universally condemned. Monks and nuns take vows of sobriety and temperance precisely to maintain a clear mind for prayer and service.
So it's not just about the substance itself, but what it does to your state of mind and your ability to fulfill your spiritual obligations.
Precisely. It's also about self-control and discipline. Monastic vows often involve renunciation of worldly pleasures and the development of self-mastery. Intoxicants are viewed as something that erodes that self-mastery, potentially leading to other moral failings. It's a slippery slope, Many monastic rules, like the Vinaya in Buddhism or canons in Christianity, explicitly forbid intoxicants as part of that ethical framework.
Now, I have to ask, what about those famous images or maybe stereotypes of, say, Benedictine monks brewing beer or making wine? How does that fit into this picture of strict prohibition?
That's a great question, and it highlights an important distinction. While some monastic orders historically brewed beer or wine, particularly in Europe, it was typically for sustenance, for nutrition, or even for medicinal purposes, especially when water sources weren't always safe. The key here is the intent and the moderation. Intoxication was still absolutely forbidden. It wasn't about getting drunk, it was about having a safe, caloric beverage, often as part of their diet. The alcohol content was sometimes lower too, and the overall context was entirely different from recreational use.
So it wasn't a party, basically.
Definitely not. It was about supporting the body to support the spiritual work, not about altering the mind for pleasure or escape. That distinction is crucial. But this brings us to the more nuanced side of the coin, doesn't it? Because while prohibition is the general rule for monastics, the broader relationship between drugs, especially psychoactive substances, and religion is actually far more complex and diverse.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. Because when we talk about religion and drugs, my mind immediately jumps to indigenous cultures and ritualistic use. Are we talking about what are sometimes called entheogens?
Precisely. Entheogens, meaning generating the divine within, are central to many ancient and indigenous spiritual traditions. These are naturally occurring psychoactive plants that have been used for millennia as sacraments in religious rituals. And here the intent is diametrically opposed to recreational intoxication.
Can you give us some examples?
Of course. Perhaps the most well-known is ayahuasca, used by shamans in the Amazon basin. It's not about getting high in a recreational sense. It's used for healing, for spiritual insight, for communication with the spirit world. It's a deeply sacred and often challenging experience guided by spiritual leaders with specific protocols.
That's a huge distinction, isn't it? The guidance, the intent, the ritual itself.
Absolutely. Another powerful example is peyote, which is central to the rituals of the Native American church. It's used as a sacrament to connect with God and foster community. Again, it's not about casual use. It's highly revered, used in a structured sacred setting for a very specific spiritual purpose. We also see historical evidence of psilocybin mushrooms being used in ancient Mesoamerican cultures for divination and spiritual experiences.
These substances aren't seen as something that clouds the mind, but rather as something that opens it, or facilitates a connection.
Exactly. The goal is altered states of consciousness, yes, but for profound spiritual insight, healing, or communal bonding, not for escape or hedonism. It's often a difficult journey, not always pleasant, but one that is believed to lead to essential truths. We can also look at cannabis, which in some branches of Hinduism, particularly by certain sadhus during festivals like Mahashivaratri, is used for meditation and spiritual insight. And of course, it's central to Rastafarianism, where it's seen as a sacred herb for connecting with Jah.
It really blows apart the simple drugs are bad, religion is good narrative, doesn't it? It adds so much nuance.
It truly does, and it forces us to look beyond our contemporary Western framework of understanding substances. The intent and the context are the absolute defining factors here. A monk's goal is a clear mind for a particular kind of meditative clarity, while an indigenous shaman's goal might be an altered state for a different kind of spiritual vision or healing.
You also mentioned historical speculation about entheogens in ancient Greek mysteries or even early Christianity. That sounds like a rabbit hole waiting to be explored.
Oh, it certainly is a deep rabbit hole, and a highly contentious one. There's ongoing academic debate and speculation about whether substances were used in, say, the Eleusinian mysteries in ancient Greece, which involve secret rituals and a revelatory experience. Some scholars have theorized about a psychoactive brew that might have been part of those rites. And yes, some even speculate about entheogens in early Christianity, though this is far more controversial and not widely accepted as definitive. The evidence is often circumstantial, relying on interpretation of ancient texts and iconography, but the fact that the debate exists shows how eager we are to understand the full scope of human spiritual experience.
It shows that humans have always sought profound experiences, and sometimes substances have played a role, whether it's forbidden or embraced. What about Sufism? I've heard references to wine in Sufi poetry that doesn't seem to be about literal alcohol.
That's a beautiful point. In many branches of Sufism, which is the mystical dimension of Islam, alcohol is strictly forbidden, as it is in mainstream Islam. However, you'll find countless historical accounts and poetic references to wine that symbolize divine love, spiritual intoxication, and ecstatic union with the divine, rather than literal alcohol. Rumi, Hafiz, their poetry is filled with this wine of divine love. It's a metaphor for the overwhelming, intoxicating experience of God's presence.
So it's about the feeling, not the substance.
Exactly. The feeling, the transcendent state. But it's also true that some historical sources suggest the occasional use of substances like hashish by certain Sufis in very specific contexts, again to aid in achieving altered states of consciousness. This was never universal and often controversial within the broader Islamic tradition, but it does exist in the historical record. Again, the intent here was spiritual exploration, not mere recreation.
It's all about that distinction. Spiritual insight versus recreational intoxication. That seems to be the crucial dividing line through all of this.
It truly is the bedrock distinction. When used sacramentally, entheogens are part of a sacred ritual guided by spiritual leaders with the explicit aim of spiritual healing, insight, or communal bonding. This is fundamentally different from recreational use, which is often aimed at pleasure, escape, or simply heedlessness. Ritual use is typically highly controlled, with strict protocols, preparation, and integration into a spiritual worldview. Uncontrolled, recreational use often lacks these safeguards, which can lead to negative consequences.
And how does all this connect to the modern world? We hear a lot about addiction, but also a growing interest in psychedelics for therapeutic uses. Where do these paths intersect with religion today?
That's a vital contemporary connection. On the one hand, many religious organizations today play an absolutely crucial role in addressing drug and alcohol addiction. They offer support, spiritual guidance, and a strong community for those seeking recovery. Faith-based programs are incredibly effective for many people because they tap into that desire for meaning and connection that often gets lost in addiction.
It makes sense. If you're looking for spiritual clarity and self-control, which is what monks strive for, then overcoming addiction aligns perfectly with those goals.
Exactly. It's about reclaiming that internal mastery. On the other hand, you have this growing contemporary interest in the therapeutic and spiritual potential of psychedelics, substances like psilocybin or MDMA, often in controlled clinical settings. This is a very different sphere from traditional monastic paths, but it does echo some of the themes we see in indigenous entheogenic use. The idea that these substances can facilitate profound insights, healing, and a deeper connection to oneself or the universe.
So, while not necessarily religious in the traditional sense, it's tapping into that same human drive for transcendence or understanding.
That's it. It's an exploration of consciousness, often with therapeutic or personal growth aims. This is still a highly debated area within many religious contexts, but it represents a modern re-engagement with the potential of altered states, albeit in a very different framework from ancient rituals or monastic discipline.
Tom, this has been an incredibly enlightening conversation. To summarize then, while monks across most major religions overwhelmingly abstain from alcohol and drugs for clarity and spiritual discipline, the broader relationship between religion and psychoactive substances is much more diverse, with ancient and indigenous traditions often using these substances sacramentally for spiritual insight and healing. Is that a fair takeaway?
Absolutely, Peter. That's a perfect encapsulation. It truly highlights the richness and complexity of human spirituality and how different paths seek connection and understanding, sometimes through renunciation and sometimes through very carefully guided exploration of consciousness with powerful plant teachers.
It really makes you think about how vast and varied human experience truly is. Thank you so much for shedding light on this intricate topic, Tom. Your insights have been invaluable.
My pleasure, Peter. Thanks for having me.
And that's all for today's episode. A huge thank you to Tom for joining us. We hope this conversation has given you a new perspective on religion, discipline, and the pursuit of spiritual understanding. Until next time, stay curious.